Okay, so this is going to be the first video that I'm recording on Billy Budd. Pretty much pick up from where we left off in class, actual class, for those of you who are there, and of course those of you who are still continuing on Zoom. So we spent a lot of time talking about Billy Budd, the handsome sailor, and getting a feel for the background, the foundation of who he is, setting things up, obviously, as beginnings of these stories and novellas do. So I don't want to go over that in too much detail. I don't want to repeat what we covered in class. I mean, I'll touch on it. We'll obviously be circling back to it consistently. I'm going to spend this video mainly covering the chapters that we didn't have a chance to cover in class, that were part of the readings for that class, the last class we had, and then we'll obviously be moving on to the next readings up to page 55, I believe, for our next class. And what I'm going to concentrate on in this video are those chapters that seem to deviate from the story, right? The chapters about the mutiny, the Great Mutiny. There are two mutinies, and also the references to Admiral Nelson, right? And that might have been a bit seemingly problematic for us when we first encounter that. What does this have to do with the story we're reading? And of course, it's difficult to ascertain that at this stage because we're just at the beginning. But it's there. It's emphasized. So we know it's important. So we're going to explore today, again, try to keep this video relatively short. I'm always trying to keep them to an hour or less. But I do want to cover this ground so that it's entrenched in you, where you can see how what comes next relates back to it. And we touched on it in class, so I'm going to go over that. I'm going to pull the text as I do up on the screen, and we'll take a look at these things. And then, of course, we can follow up and return to it a little bit on our next class before we move on to the next chapters. All right, so let me call up the text. All right. So we ended off pretty much talking about Billy. We've discussed how Billy is compared to so many characters from the past, many of them mythological figures, biblical figures. You know, interestingly, the blending of all these types of references and allusions, they're interesting insofar as it really makes, it's positioning Billy in such a way that he's a little bit of all these things, not just necessarily one or the other. So he's encapsulating so much that is contained in figures like Hercules, Apollo, right? Mythological characters that are not real. But of course, there's also the biblical references, particularly to Adam, right? And of course, as we discussed in class, this sense, and a lot of it geared towards Adam, of his innocence, this sense of purity. And of course, when you're looking at the Greek gods, while they weren't necessarily pure, they were representing something other earthly, just as we have with the biblical references. Something that is more than just human, but not rooted in just one of these mythologies, encapsulating the whole concept of mythology and the mythological stories that predate Christianity, predate Judaism, they go way back when we're looking at the Greeks. The idealization of Billy, when he's referred to as Greek statue, those idealized images of the perfect man, so to speak. So we have all this going on, but we've also seen, and keep in mind as well, just to remind you, the references to Adam, as we see here, right? Billy in many respects was a little more than a sort of upright barbarian. Okay, barbarian, we talked about this in class, barbarian in relation to Adam, how does that tie in? Well, much such perhaps as Adam presumably might have been ere the urbane serpent wriggled himself into his company. Adam before the fall. Adam before the temptation, before the eating of the fruit from the tree of knowledge. All right, and so barbarian in that sense, again, we usually have these negative connotations associated with barbarian, but at the same time, it's referencing in the Judeo-Christian concept, particularly the Christian concept, someone who is not of the same belief in terms of Christianity, and therefore is considered barbarian because they haven't found God, so to speak. And of course, in terms of what developed into the Christian God in particular, before the eating of the fruit from the tree of knowledge, none of this was available. None of this was conceivable. Like the idea of sin and all this, which is such a cornerstone of Christian doctrine, did not exist until the eating of the fruit from the tree of knowledge. So that's where the barbarian comes in, and again the purity of Adam and Eve before the fall, and that speaks to the innocence, utter purity, innocence, immortality, no concept of death, no concept of shame, guilt, or any of these things. They didn't exist until they ate from that tree. But we also notice with all these allusions to biblical and Greek mythological figures and so on, especially when we see the references to the Greek gods were not perfect, right? They had many human qualities. So that ties in a bit with the understanding that no visible blemish indeed with the lady, but on occasional liability to a vocal defect. We talked about this, right? He's talking about how perfect in so many ways Billy is. He's the handsome sailor. We spent a lot of time talking about that. He's good looking. He seems a bit perhaps naive, quite innocent. The peacemaker, right? Everyone is attracted to him, even the one person who challenges him, Billy seemingly not even aware that he's being challenged, but just spontaneously responding with violence with Red Whiskers. And then Red Whiskers, loves him afterwards, right? Billy has this aura about him. People gravitate to him. And it's emphasized, very importantly, that it is natural. This sense of innocence, this sense of purity in Billy is natural. It's not predicated on his upbringing because he knows nothing. We know nothing of his upbringing. Remember, he's a foundling. No past. But he also has this one defect that's emphasized to us, the stutter. Okay, and that because it's emphasized to us, we want to take note. How is this going to come back into play later on in the story? And then again, to continue the allusions to the Bible and allusions to mythology and all these things, all these otherworldly, not historically based, right? There's no historical evidence of the Garden of Eden or of Adam or of the serpent. And to continue in that vein, that the stutter, it's suggested, was a striking instance that, in this particular Billy, was a striking instance that the arch interferer, the envious marplot of Eden, the envious marplot of Eden is the serpent. The serpent has come over time to represent Satan. All right, so I mean, it's blending, very rigid ideas regarding Christianity and Christian doctrine, but into a blending with so much more, going back to the past, related to issues which are beyond empirical evidence. Where its mythology comes in. All religions, many, most, come into play. Trying to understand, explore the possibilities regarding that which is unknown. Where did we come from? Where are we going? Death. Otherworldly things. So the marplot of Eden is the serpent, and envious marplot of Eden, right? Still, and keep in mind the idea of envy and jealousy as we proceed in the story. Still has more or less to do, the suggestion is the arch interferer still has more to do with every human consignment to this planet of Earth. In every case, one way or another, he is sure to slip his little card, as much as to remind us, I too have a hand here. Okay, so this is, inferring that, break it down to its most fundamental form, good and evil. Good and evil as part of our world. Suggesting as well as all these manifestations in which we view Billy up to this point, especially in terms of that innocence and purity, but there's always going to be the hand of the other in there, which will not allow it to be totally pure. There will be a flaw, right? And it's described as a flaw, this stutter. All right. Now, we get this build up to this, discussion of this stutter and all these other things concerning Billy. And then, and that's just in the first two chapters. When we get to chapter 3, the story seems to shift a little bit. And it's talking about the two mutinies, the mutiny at Spithead and the mutiny at Nore. There's been some references to it up to this point, but now we're going to get it into a little more detail. And these are important. Remember, our story is taking place just a couple of months after these mutinies. And it's being emphasized in terms of how impactful the mutinies were on the social structure, particularly the military structure, at a time when England was at war, right, with France, Napoleon. So again, we have to understand the content. The narrator is telling the story from a perspective of the future. He's recounting what transpired in the past. Right? Important to keep that in mind. The narrator isn't in the moment. It is telling the story that happened in the past. The Billy Budd itself was written in 1891. Okay, and we're going to see as we're talking about this mutiny, which is contemporary with the setting and the time of the story. But then when we talk about Nelson, right, Nelson died in 1805. So it's you have to keep track of these things, and only insofar as to understand why they're being brought to our attention and how they're significant to this story, even though he's talking about things that transpired before the story took place and things that transpired after. Be attentive to these timelines. So they're talking about the uprisings at Spithead, and particularly the one at Nore, which is known as the Great Mutiny. And it was indeed a demonstration more menacing to England than the contemporary manifestos in conquering and proselytizing armies of the French Directory. What's that telling us? That the military and the society, which was very much governed by the military at a time of war. Remember, that comes back to what we were saying, one of the themes, right? The individual versus society. Remember the name of the first boat that Billy's on, The Rights of Man, coming from Thomas Paine, but also coming from the idea, the ideological idea of the emphasis on individual rights and the sacrifice of those rights for the restrictions imposed by society, by governments, in order to ensure that the society functions in a manner that is productive. Where it is even more so is at a time of war. Remember, we were the most of these sailors and soldiers during the war are impressed into service. They're drafted, and in a very often ruthless way. We'll see references where they talk about the practice of they need more sailors because they need more ships because they're fighting this war. And they go into the prisons and grab prisoners and force them to fight on the ships. And they may not be the best of sailors or soldiers or warriors because their character, and they don't want to be there. Right? Billy is forcibly taken from the Rights of Man and put on the Indomitable. Right? That comes up in later on in the, I guess it's the readings for next week, but you should, well, if you haven't read yet, so I'll wait on that. When he is tempted, right, with the gold coins, because they recognize that you were impressed too, right? But we'll come to that. We'll talk about that in class. And so that these great mutinies were more troublesome in many ways for the powers that be within English society than the actual war with the French, because this was rebellion from within. And this has the potential of being utterly disruptive at a time shortly after, no, shortly before, in the same milieu, time frame, where revolutions, French Revolution and so on, were taking place as a response to new ideological thinking in regarding the idea of the Enlightenment. The established order was being challenged from many sectors. And there was revolution in the air. But importantly, the need to, and the French Revolution in particular, was very worrisome to other European nations because of the fear that it could happen in their own country. And this was still resonating. So the need to maintain order and suppress any notion of rebellion from within. It goes on, right? So we know the importance of this because our narrator is going on at great length. Again, I don't want to get into too much of the actual what transpired in the Nore Mutiny. Suffice to say that thousands of soldiers and sailors revolted. It was put down. It was contained. It was controlled. Many of the soldiers who were part of the rebellion actually, when the rebellion was finally put down, went back and served and fought in the battles. But the emphasis in this story is to give us the context where discipline and maintaining order, especially in the military, was paramount. There is a fear in the air that this could happen again. Remember the structure of these warships, right? You have your officers and then you have your servicemen. And it's a very strictly maintained hierarchy, as was society, right? It is representative of a society that had very noticeable and entrenched class distinctions. It's one of the reasons why revolution was in the air, the have and the have-nots. You had the aristocratic elites running everything, and you had, the masses who had very little. And we see that in play here, where they could be just drawn away and forced into military in the name of society, in the name of maintaining societal cohesiveness. And of course, that works in direct opposition to the rights of the individual. One of the main themes that's being explored in the story. And again, keeping that in mind, I think very much you'll see how important it comes in relation to the plot, in relation to what transpires with Billy Budd on the ship. Again, it goes into the details of the first uprising. That was the one at Spithead. It was put down. Final suppression, however, there was, but only made possible perhaps by the unswerving loyalty of the Marine Corps and voluntary resumption of loyalty among influential sections of the crew. So there, again, demonstrating that when it says, and the voluntary resumption of loyalty among certain influential sections of the crews that were part of the rebellion, that there was still a sense of loyalty. It was a time of war, right? So it was a combination of the military putting down the insurrection, and of course they're putting it's their own people, and mixed loyalties. It really, again, something to be considering here is, yes, believing in the rights of the individual. I have the right as an individual to certain things, but I also have a responsibility to my community. And again, in this day of COVID, I think we can very much have an understanding of that, right? As an individual, and my belief in individual rights, if I want to go out for a walk at 11 o'clock at night, right, I should be able to. But society, understandably, right, debatably, understandably, says, no, I can't. If I do, and I get caught, I'm going to have a hefty fine. We're not allowed to do certain things. And again, it's not you can take an extreme example as an individual and my individual rights. Why should I have to stop at a red light? Right? Why should I follow any of these rules that infringes upon my rights? But of course we do, because we recognize that those rules and regulations that are in place are for our own protection and for the betterment of our society. Why should I pay taxes on my hard-earned money? Well, those taxes go to make sure that I have a living environment that is, the roads are fixed, etc. And certainly here in Canada, and to help, my fellow community members and myself, social insurance and everything else. But it's always infringing upon the individual, the pure idea of individual rights. So it's the navigating the idea of the individual within the community and the society. Here we're seeing extreme examples of it because it's at a time of war, and it's particularly in a militaristic, in a military environment of this society, which is dominant at a time of war. And even more so, it's in an enclosed environment out at sea on a ship. So we're getting this in the extreme, right? More reason to have the discipline in place. And this is very much a worrying situation for the powers that be, the people in power, because of the mutinies, where the people said, no, enough. Don't want to do this anymore. Okay, so that fine line of maintaining order and discipline, at what cost to those individuals, running the risk that it could get out of hand, as it did in the mutinies. So it's creating that idea of the tension that is in place here, and the problems that could be incurred should there be any kind of insurrection. So the officers attentive to that possibility of insurrection, the need through discipline, military, right? Remember, we're in the military here, to have very strict adherence to the military disciplinary rules and make sure everyone knows it, so everyone does what they need to do, because if one person doesn't do their job, the whole machine can fall apart. Everyone must be on board. Which is normally the case, but now even much more heightened because of these mutinies. Okay. And as I said, down here, we can see that some of those mutineers actually went on and back into the military, back into the Navy, and were participating with Nelson and the Battle of Trafalgar. Now, what's that? We're about to get to that, because he goes in. Remember, he's going to segue from this discussion of the mutinies for the reasons that I suggest, also giving you some historical context. From chapter 3 here into chapter 4. Now, in chapter 4, remember in your book, this is what's up at the top, right? The epigraph. And you want to be attentive to these. They're not in every chapter, but when you see it, right, you see it in our book, oops, right up here, right? And what does it say? It says what's said here. Concerning, and then in quotes, the greatest sailor since our world began, and then we see Tennyson. All right. So, and I know we didn't touch on this in class, and I can return to it if you have a question. Tennyson is referring to Alfred Lord Tennyson. He was a famous poet. And he wrote a poem commemorating a Lord Wellington, who was the general who defeated in the final battle of Waterloo, bear with me, in 1815 defeated Napoleon, and when Napoleon was out seemingly trying to conquer all of Europe. I'm not going to get into a history lesson of the Napoleonic Wars, but Wellington was a famous general, mainly known for this huge victory. Of course, knows that happens after the time of our story. That's what I was saying. The reason he brings it up, because Wellington wasn't the sailor. In the poem, he references Alfred Lord Tennyson, the poet, references the greatest sailor since our world began. And that sailor he's referring to is Admiral Nelson. And what we have in this chapter is discussion of a number of things. We don't have time for everything, but in particular, Admiral Nelson. It's talking about, right, it starts off in this strange way, seemingly, about the introduction from China into Europe of gunpowder, right? It's giving us a little brief history related to the advent of different type of weaponry in the military and in warfare. Emphasizing to us, this is why I say you have to be somewhat attentive to the timeline, that this is taking place, yes, after the advent of gunpowder, but at the same time before the dramatic changes in weaponry that came in the 1800s, especially naval, where they started introducing, there's a reference to it here, the armored ships, right? We're on an old school, if you will, 74 gun warship, right? I think next class, I'll put up some images of what these ships look like. You know, and it's wood, it's got cannon and all that, but that changed. Now, if you know, ships are now made of steel and you know, all kinds of different kinds of metallic devices for greater protection, and that really came into play and understood by the middle of the 1800s, certainly by the American Civil War, which started in 1860, with the Monitor and the famous first time clash of two armored ships at sea. This is before that time. And emphasizing that the before that time, and then talking about the greatest sailor since our world began, that Tennyson references in a poem about a General Wellington, but the greatest sailor he's referring to in that fairly long poem is Nelson. And Nelson is elevated in the annals of history in a huge place, not just for his military prowess as a naval commander, but also for his personality, projecting the ideal type of leader, fearless, righteous, all these things. The greatest sailor since our world began. And in this description of him, and I'm going to move a little faster here because I do want to get to where this is going. Well, the ships that are ironclads is what I was referring to. You see it down here, ironclad ships. There's the Monitor right there. Whereas Nelson was on an old school 74 gun ship called the Victory. Now, why all this amount of time spent on talking about Nelson? Well, what's going to directly follow this is the introduction of Captain Vere, our captain on this ship, the Indomitable, Billy's captain. And clearly we're meant to compare what we know about Captain Vere to Nelson, this charismatic historical figure, to help us get a better assessment of who Captain Vere is. Not because Captain Vere is like Admiral Nelson. On the contrary, we'll see some stark differences. So it's drawn in to look at it through comparison. Because what we see here, right, in terms of when Nelson was actually killed at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, the description here gives you an idea of how that death occurred. And it is related to a bit of the charismatic, flamboyant nature of who Nelson was. For example, prompted by the sight of, get this out here, by the sight of the star inserted in the Victory's quarterdeck. The Victory was the name of the ship that Nelson was on. designating the spot where the great sailor, right, the greatest sailor, the great sailor fell. These martial utilitarians may suggest considerations implying, so he's talking about the spot that is marked with a star on the ship, the Victory, the spot where Nelson was killed. Some suggested some considerations implying that Nelson's ornate publication of his person, remember, this is Melville and Melville's way of saying things. We talked about this in our last class. His ornate publication of his person, how he presented himself in a very ornate way. Flashy. In battle was not, so it's implying that Nelson's ornate, showy way of presenting himself during the battle, in battle, was not only unnecessary, but not military, nay, savored of foolhardiness and vanity. They may add, too, that at Trafalgar, it was in effect nothing less than a challenge to death, and death came. And that, but for his bravado, the victorious admiral might possibly have survived the battle. So what is this all telling us? Our narrator is suggesting, again, the greatest sailor since our world began was killed at the Battle of Trafalgar on the deck of the Victory because he was wearing an ornate uniform that drew attention. So he was marked by the enemy, could see him, distinguish him from everyone else on the ship. Our narrator is saying that some people, it doesn't say he does, but some people would argue that this was foolish and he was doing it out of vanity. Vainglorious, remember we talked about that word? Now we're seeing vanity brought into the discussion again. Alerts us to be attentive to characters that we are going to meet on this journey who are vain. The suggestion here, it was because of his vanity, because he wanted to dress up in the manner that he did. Maybe a sense of hubris. He got killed. And if he hadn't had that kind of vanity, remember the handsome sailor, there's none of that vainglorious attitude about him. There is none. The greatest sailor since our world began, because of his vanity, it is suggested here. It is suggested by the narrator that other people thought this. Unnecessarily died on the deck of the Victory at the Battle of Trafalgar. So while he was a great sailor, a great strategist, a great leader, charismatic, people were drawn to him. Again, it goes on here, he was revered. But he allowed that to get to his head to some degree. And that ultimately was his downfall. So we have these two chapters, right? Chapters 3 and 4 coming right after we find out that last little bit about Billy and Billy's flaw. We get the setting, establishing the tensions that would be on all the ships during this military moment shortly after the mutinies. We are introduced to a fairly lengthy discussion of Captain Nelson in relation, right? It segues from the mutinies. Nelson was was a sailor, was obviously active during then, and helped to put down the mutinies, became a huge leader in the Navy up until Trafalgar, setting the tone, introducing us to arguably the ideal naval commander. Setting is established right after we're introduced to Billy and where Billy comes from in terms of recent past, writes a man to the indomitable. We have all that discussion about impressed servitude, creating and establishing that individuality versus society, government. Billy's purity, innocence in this setting, the setting more firmly established with the mutinies, descriptions of the mutinies, and an idyllic description of this great naval icon, but challenging and suggesting that even in the greatest sailor of all time, supposedly, a flaw. Vanity. Continues a bit here in chapter 5. So the discontent foreran the two mutinies, more or less, it just to establish now, basically it takes chapters 3, chapters 4, kind of pulls them together. Discontent foreran the two mutinies, and more or less it lurkingly survived them. Discontent, again, I'm also be attentive to the way that Melville writes, right? Discontent foreran the two mutinies, and more or less it being discontent, lurkingly survived them. The strong suggestion just in this simple sentence, well, not simple, but is that the narrator is revealing to us there is still discontent, lurking, the word lurking. Where? Well, for our intents and purposes, on the indomitable. That's why we had all this information given to us. At sea, precautionary vigilance was strained against relapse. Precautionary vigilance to ensure that there is not a relapse back into a mutiny. At short notice, engagement might come on. When it did, the lieutenants assigned to batteries felt it incumbent upon them, the lieutenants are being the officers, in some instances to stand with drawn swords behind the men working the guns. When they're in battle, because of their fear of possible mutiny, the officers, while the naval men were manning the cannons, loading the cannons, firing the cannons, the lieutenants, the officers would stand behind them with their swords drawn, making sure they do their job, that there's no rebellion, that there's not just no rebellion, but that they're doing their job. Really lets you know what kind of atmosphere is here on this ship. Okay, now we get into chapter 6, and okay, well, it's a good time. All this, now again, note structurally how Melville does this. You get those first 2 chapters, it's Billy, the Indomitable, the Rights of Man, Red Whiskers. It's really the handsome sailor. It's really about the personalities, the individuals, the characters that we're dealing with, setting them up on the sea, the impressment, all this is established. Then there seems to be a deviation where we're getting a greater context, right? Chapters 3, 4, and 5, yeah. And then we segue into chapter 6 after Nelson and the mutinies, and almost as if, like, where's Billy and all? Where's Billy been? Right? I was just getting to know Billy. Oh, it's all this historical stuff. This isn't a history class. Well, we come back, but along the way, coming back to Billy, we're going to meet someone else. And it's very important to note structurally that we meet Captain Edward Fairfax Vere after we have this discussion of Admiral Captain / then Admiral Nelson. In their general bearing, and let's just go here. This will get us set up for what we're going to be discussing in our next class, where because we still haven't met, right? There's the third character, Claggart, and they make the triad here: Billy, Captain Vere, and Claggart. Right, and if you've read ahead, which you probably have by now, you'll know who Claggart is. This is what we'll be talking about in our next class. In their general bearing and conduct, the commissioned officers of a warship naturally take their tone from their commander, right? Just as they would have for Nelson. You know, Nelson sets the tone for how things are going to be conducted. And while he was vain and drew too much attention to himself, and again, it goes back, it's described in those chapters, and it's going to be returned to with Captain Vere. He commanded respect without having to demand it. And that ties back into this idea of the natural abilities of these characters. Nelson was a natural leader, just a little too vain, perhaps. But it's a necessary component in a leader. How does a leader control insurrection? How does a leader keep these impressed servicemen from rebelling? Right? Is it by having his lieutenants threatening them with swords during a battle? Probably not the best way. But maybe the only way that can be done given the mutinies and everything else. The suggestion was that Nelson didn't have to do that, as that his men loved him. And that sets the tone, and that's what we're getting here now. That's another reason why it was so prominent at these early stages of the novella. The commissioned officers of a warship naturally be attentive to the use of the word nature, naturally, and so on throughout. There's a big emphasis because we've seen this. These things are very natural to Billy in terms of who he is. They're not learned. They don't seem to be learned. They seem to be natural. Even when he gets angry at Red Whiskers, it was a natural reaction. Naturally take their tone from the commander, that is, if he have the ascendancy of character that ought to be his, right? Again, coming back to Nelson, take the tone from the commander, as long as the commander, right, commands properly, has a natural ability for that, because if he doesn't, then that's problematic. One of the great challenges of any leader, right, is in order to maintain the loyalty of their immediate officers and then dribble down to all the men, whatever. Captain the Honorable Edward Fairfax Vere, to give his full title, was a bachelor of 40. Right now we're getting, again, introduced. Important, because we're going to be looking at him in relation to the flamboyant Admiral Nelson, right? To some degree. But we're also here now, having been exposed to the greatest sailor, right? A captain aboard one of many, many warships fighting in this war. So how does our captain, what's our captain like? What is Billy's captain like? Bachelor of 40, we got his age, not married, not a family man. Take note. or thereabouts, a sailor of distinction, even a time prolific of renowned seamen. So he is distinguished, okay, of distinction. Though allied to the higher nobility, his advancement had not been altogether owing to influences connected with that circumstances. He comes from the nobility. He comes from the upper classes, the aristocracy of sorts, of so on. But they're emphasizing that he didn't get his position because of contacts. It was common back then, right? You're born into a family of affluence, then they will pay the right people to ensure that you get a high position. Very common, by the way, in these times, which led to a lot of really poor officers, because they were officers only because they came from families that could push them through to that position. They didn't necessarily earn it. That's why it's emphasized here. His advancements had not been altogether owing to influences connected with that circumstances. He had seen much service. He's a seasoned veteran, been in various engagements, a number of battles, always acquitting himself as an officer mindful of the welfare of his men, but never tolerating an infraction of discipline. Thoroughly versed in the science of his profession and intrepid to the verge of temerity, though never injudiciously so. Okay, so what we're getting here is a description of a pretty impressive captain. He earned his way to the captaincy. He's been in a number of engagements, always demonstrating himself to be an officer who cares about his men. This is the key component, right? And is therefore expected to do what's best for his men, as opposed to many officers. Maybe a little suggestion with Nelson as well, but in any case, for many officers who don't care about their men, treat their men poorly, for a variety of reasons, not the least which is the hierarchy of class distinctions and so on, authority figures, and just treat the masses as rabble that have to be always never cared about, just do their job, treating them like machines, like numbers. We're getting here a taste of Captain Vere as someone who does care about the welfare of his men. Now, what kind of personality? Remember, again, compared to Nelson, right, who had this element of flamboyant behavior. Ashore in the garb of a civilian, scarce anyone would have taken him for a sailor. He's unassuming. More especially that he never garnished unprofessional talk with nautical terms, right? So what we come to find out about this, again, I don't want to read the whole thing, is he has other interests as well. He's a very intellectually driven captain. We will see here, as you've read, he's very bookish. They talk about he always brings a library, like a number of books with him, and he likes to read about philosophy and history, right? Very much indicating not just a well-read, knowledgeable, but because the emphasis on philosophy, someone who is not just learning about dates, but thinking about his role as a leader, the philosophical implications of it, etc. He's a thinker. He's not rash. He's not just, doing by rote. He's a thinker. He's thinking what's best for my men, what's the best way to maintain order and discipline on this ship. I'm a captain. I can't just look at a rule book and follow it, without thinking about it. He's a thinker. He's modest. We get this here. Modest, in contrast to vain. Okay. Accompanying a resolute, see nature again, modesty, evinced at all times, not calling for pronounced action, and which shown in any rank of life suggests a virtue aristocratic in kind. Captain Vere, though practical enough upon occasion, would at times betray a certain dreaminess of mood. It's interesting. Standing alone on the weather side of the quarterdeck. I'm spending this amount of time on Captain Vere because he is that important to the story. One hand holding by the rigging, he would absently gaze off at the blank sea, thinking, dreaming. At the presentation to him then of some minor matter interrupting the current of his thoughts, he would show more or less irascibility, but instantly he would control it. Irascibility, he'd get annoyed, but instantly he would control it. He's out there thinking about whatever, and someone comes up, sir, we have, okay, yes, and then immediately get control of it. Importance of names. In the Navy, he was popularly known by the appellation Starry Vere. Now, we know his name is Vere. His nickname is Starry Vere. Now, again, without getting too involved in names, though we could have a blast with it because Melville's very does this often, especially as I referenced to you in class last in Moby Dick. But Vere is an interesting name. Vere comes from the Latin veritas, truth, according to truth. Okay? Again, for what it's worth, take it now because you'll see why this is important later on. Starry, well, we're seeing that he's introduced to his name, Starry Vere. Starry Vere, right after we see him absently gazing off at the blank sea. Starry-eyed, starry gaze, right? It's you know, looking up at the stars. Right? So we have this idea when you're looking at the stars, or the term starry can be seen as looking for something, gazing. And if we attach that to Vere, veritas, truth, we can see the Honorable Edward Fairfax Vere as symbolically and metaphorically as being he who is searching for truth. And that ties in with his bookish nature and his interest in philosophy. The Starry Vere as well, this is Melville at his best playing with so many different things, is suggested here by our narrator that it comes from a poem by Andrew Marvell. And in that poem, it makes a reference to, and here's the quote from the poem, this tis to have been from the first in a domestic heaven nursed under the discipline severe of Fairfax and Starry Vere. Okay? Severe, right? Again, this is intertextuality. We've seen it's similar to what he was doing with the allusions to biblical references, biblical characters, Greek mythological characters, Greek gods, and so on. In a perfect world, we would say, oh, Billy was compared to Hercules. Well, what do we know about Hercules? Well, let's go find out everything we know about Hercules and bring that into the story. right? We did a little bit more of it with Adam because that's a little more familiar to us. But all the other references to outside, for the most part, in terms of, you know, fictional characters that have huge stories that surround them. The suggestion is, and this is a term called intertextuality, they're bringing in the text of Hercules, right, in Greek mythology, is being brought into this story by the reference to it in relation to Billy. How far you go with that, well, you have, there's limits. Well, we're getting the same thing here. We could go and track down, if you're a graduate student at university, this is what you would do. You would go and track it down, and then you would, sorry, I'm just going to shut this down. You would track it down and look at the whole poem and draw on all aspects of the poem to have a better understanding of what this particular line is referencing in terms of the overall picture. Hold, let me just. Okay. Sorry, I can't seem to show. Oh, no, let me get it now before that call comes again. And, okay. Sorry. So back to it. So what I'm trying to get at is we're getting the one line out of a very large poem. We're not in a position to look at the whole poem. We could, if we were graduate students, do just that. But what we do have to do then is and it can be done on both levels. What we do have to take is the quote that we have. We see this mention of Severe. We're seeing that this is suggesting where he received his nickname, Starry Vere. It's coming from a famous poet, adds to the bookish nature and so on of what we understand to be this development of the character of our captain. But of course, we also have, even without this reference, our ability to break down the name just on what it is there. Okay? And so upon embracing his cousin Ronnie. Okay, so I believe I asked you just to read up to here, which I probably should have had you read through through chapter 7 as well, because it continues with him. But I think that'll work nicely in this introduction to Captain Vere in the context of everything we've just been seeing regarding the mutiny, regarding Captain Nelson, of course, going back regarding Billy himself. We get an idea of who he is. Much of that bookish nature that I was talking about, I think, comes into, right, it's in the next chapter, which you've probably read by the time you watch this. We're going to talk about this. We're going to segue. I'm going to stop here so that we can segue into and start our conversation next class talking about Captain Vere. All right, so actually this works out well because it's really important to get a good grasp of who he is, and then into Claggart. So by the end of our next class, we will really have established our core characters, and then the plot will begin to unfold in a more precise manner. Anyways, hang in there if you're having difficulties or feeling challenged with Melville's language and all the information that you're encountering, especially when you're having to deal with historical context of mutinies and famous admirals and so on. We're now going to, and you've already engaged that because you're reading the next section, into the particulars of our story. But this context is important to really gain an appreciation of what's coming. And back to that idea of intertextuality, all these references alluding to these other characters and poems and even history adds a richness and layers upon layers to this story that you could track down. That makes this, and Melville's one of the masters of this, endlessly refreshing and endlessly intriguing, because there's always more to unpack if you choose to, just if nothing else, by those illusions. All right, we'll talk more about Captain Vere in class, and we'll get from Captain Vere, which we've been introduced here in the video, to Claggart, and proceed from there. All right, and we'll end it now, and we will see you in class.